country where you came from? Which country where you came from?
Czech Republic. Czech Republic, Prague.
Hi, my name is Benjamin Skolnick, and I work with the American Bird Conservancy, but we chair the Alliance for Zero Extinction currently, and it's one of various tools, such as we heard this morning about key biodiversity areas, that use the Red List to further focus conservation actions on the ground. Alliance for Zero Extinction sites being encompassed by key biodiversity areas. And so my question is, in having not explored the online tools, I enjoyed the presentations greatly, and I'm curious if in the National Red List process there's a way for experts to flag species that are restricted to single sites. For example, all Alliance for Zero Extinction species are critically endangered or endangered, and their global population is restricted to a single site. And that information resides in the experts. And it's my experience so far seeing the KBA, the Key Biodiversity Area process, and Alliance for Zero Extinction process, and the important bird areas, is that you have to wait till the Red List is produced and then analyze that information and try to extract that out. But I think you potentially lose some rich information at the time of assessment, where the expert, for example, the Alliance for Zero Extinction has had success recently forming some national alliances, and we'll discuss this in the workshop related on the 11th. And in Mexico, for example, we had a bunch of experts get together and, using their national Red List, come up with the AZ sites for the country. But it seems duplicative to me. So I'm curious if there's, we encouraged, maybe a checkbox or something like that on, but maybe it exists, so that's my question.
As far as I know, nothing. You mean on the global Red List or on national Red List?
It would, but either or would be interesting.
Well, on the global Red List, as far as I know, there is no plans to include a tick box for species that are found only in one site. One of the advantages, one of the things that we really try to encourage countries to do is to include supporting information with their Red List assessments. So a Red List could just be a list of the species name and the category it's found in. But the real value in a Red List assessment is in the data that goes into that assessment. And a lot of that, like you say, is simply found only in experts' heads, beyond what would be the Red List or the Red Book that you publish. So if on the global Red List, that information would be found basically by trawling through all of the assessment categories, or all of the assessments, which is very time consuming.
So I just add to that, there is actually in the underlying database that holds the data for the global Red List, there is a checkbox for recording whether the species has a highly restricted range, and there is a plausible threat as well. That's direct species to a particular criterion. So that's one way that you could identify those kind of species. But as Rebecca says, you would then have to read the documentation to find the further details on that.
As far as the national Red List goes, I mean, basically each country has the right to determine what their national Red List is going to look like and what kind of data they're going to report on. So, I mean, I would encourage any country who's going to start producing a national Red List to try to provide as much data as possible. If that's in some sort of database, so it's even easier to find that kind of information, but even if it's just in species accounts, actually recording the information that goes into the assessment is really critical to knowing what to do to protect that species, or to understanding why you assessed a particular species in a particular category. So that's really important.
Thank you. I am Mirena. I come from Ethiopia. I work for Wildlife Conservation Authority. My question is, development of the national Red List for each country is, a blessed idea. But I am hearing from the presentations and from different comments that it will be a very expensive venture in terms of getting the funds. This is one scenario, and the other scenario is, okay, every country will have its own national Red List, and what would be the international significance? That means The red list can be used as an input, for example, for conventions like CITES, to put them into the appendix, which has got, generally a TEAS convention which has a TEAS, so that it can have many implications on that country which has got, a species on the appendixes, but just to get to the international trade and other consumptive utilizations. So, even if considering that it is a very expensive venture, it needs a lot of money, and after doing that red list, so let's suppose if a country A lists a certain species in its red list, and country B will have, due to different criteria, will not list as a red list species. So what will be the scientific significance behind or implementations of particularly other conventions, just like AWA, CMES, and particularly CITES? Thank you.
I think when it comes to finances, finances are a difficult subject no matter whether you're looking at your own bank account or doing a national red list or whatever. But I think it's important to think about things relatively. Doing a national red list isn't free, and it can be expensive. It can also be done cheaply depending on how you collect the data. And if you're holding huge workshops where you invite hundreds of people, it's going to be quite expensive. If you do something online and you try and get the data remotely, then it can be a lot cheaper. But it's also important to think about it relatively. Countries spend hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars on lots of things that may or may not have a big impact on biodiversity or people's livelihoods. This money just is spent. Companies spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on things that we never specifically see the result to. So the money exists. There's billions of dollars that go around the world for mobile phones, and sports people earn millions of dollars a year. So it's not that there's a lack of money. It's just we could get into a whole discussion of subsidies and how much money could be generated if that whole way of doing things were changed. I don't actually think that money is a problem. I think that the way we, as a global society, choose to spend our money and choose to allocate funds is the problem.
I'm Asma from the Royal Botanic Garden. Just talking about money as the Jordanian experience. Sorry. We have a lot of trouble with money. Yes, you're right, the money exists, but how do you ensure that your country prioritizes the issue to spend on it? And this is one thing that we face. But one of the tips that you can use is we utilized the CBD as a mechanism to prioritize, saying that yes, we did sign that convention, and within it there's the global strategy for plant conservation, and then you have to do a national strategy for plant conservation as a tool to ensure that they give you that money. That's one level. The other level is what you can do is within the embassies in countries like Jordan, they have foreign aid, and that's how we funded ours, through the foreign aid of mostly European countries. Sweden, I know, France as well, that they would fund you. So there is certain ways you can go around the funding that is available and ensure when you do apply for the fund to ensure that they give it specifically to you for that very reason. Because sometimes, I'm not saying all times, they can say once you get that money allocated from, you develop relationship with that embassy or the foreign aid agency, and then the country, your country, the government finds out, and then they'll say, okay, well, red list is not really a priority, and may take it to another issue. So make sure when you do apply, you specify exactly what you want it for biodiversity conservation, for example. So these are just tools.
Well, I'm coming from Cuba, and I would like to refer if there is a risk or some trends to see the that there can be some degree of trend in some national levels to think, for example, that to call the attention to try to include more species on the red list. And even when the criteria are very, very clear in some cases, there always a space to like different appreciations. No? For example, in the land shells, that they have very low densities of population, very restricted habitats. But that's the behavior of the species. They've always been like this. They are restricted. So then the trend in some cases is just to put vulnerable. When it's always been like this. There are no constructions there. There are no people living in these places. So this sometimes affects in regions or in some areas the idea of the red list, because if it's a big red list, it is also meanings that the conservation is not working that well. It's not that we have many endangered species. No, it's like it's something that is not working well. So you refer to the disparities between the national and the global. It can be, but sometimes in the taxonomies and not the scientists, there is this trend to everything is vulnerable, endangered. That kind of criteria sometimes needs to be revised too, but it's very hard because the criteria are there and there is a subjective criteria also for that.
Which I think this is a really, really important point. This does happen a lot, and this is one thing that we try to emphasize. I mean, this is where sometimes people can learn the red list, talking specifically about the IUCN red list methodology. There are tools out there for them to learn it on their own. But these are the kinds of details that come out when you're in touch and you specifically try to build capacity. That we try to clarify these sort of situations. You know, some of the stuff about, well, can you really use these criteria for less known species? Those kinds of things that we can discuss when we do training workshops or other kinds of training. This is another issue that comes up a lot, and we really emphasize that the IUCN system in particular was designed to evaluate extinction risk. And it's not designed to identify species that are a conservation priority for any reason. So if you have a species that's found in a very, very small place, but that's its natural range, and there are no threats to that place, that species isn't threatened. It might be very highly restricted, but it's not currently threatened with extinction because it could exist there. If it's been there for hundreds of thousands of years, it will continue to be there for hundreds of thousands of years unless something changes, either its life history or the habitat in which it lives. So we would not call that species vulnerable or near threatened. That would be this concerned species until something then takes place in that area where it's found. And then that species could very quickly become very highly threatened because it is so restricted. But this is something I think is really important to distinguish between a list of species that is at risk of extinction and a list of species that you want to protect for any reason. It might be a culturally important species, it might be an economically valuable species, and you would want to make sure that those species are protected, and you may want to include them in national legislation. Likewise, just because a species is really highly threatened, there may be nothing you can do about it. It may not, when you're setting conservation priorities, you may not choose to spend lots of money trying to protect or recover a species that's declining for reasons beyond our control. So this is a really important distinction to make.
Can I make a comment on that? Because one thing is species status, a different thing is threats it is exposed to, and a different thing is the action you may want to implement to get rid of those threats. But I think that if a species meets with the criteria, it is threatened. It's just there is, I mean, it's naturally threatened. It's like a species that is restricted naturally to single site. It's naturally threatened, and I mean, there can be a lot of catastrophic effects and reasons for why you can lose that species. It doesn't mean that it's threatened because of human activity, and it doesn't mean that your actions had to be implemented to decrease the human pressure of that species, but actually it has a high risk of extinction, and you should identify it at-risk species. But that's different from saying, well, we should implement these kind of actions to protect that species. Basically, maybe when you have to do is monitor the status of the species. So what I'm trying to say is, I think the criteria define whether the species is threatened or not. Then a different question is what you should do with that information. And these criteria are based to, as you said, to identify whether they are threatened or not.
This is something that we really didn't get into in our presentations at all, but there are lots of different examples for countries around the world that have taken their threatened species list, which has identified species at risk of extinction, and then turned that into government policies and species action plans to go that next step. So what do you do about it, and which species do you target for conservation action? So that's just one of the many kinds of things that, as we get a national red listing network really up and running, and regional red listing networks in different regions around the world, that's the kind of best practice or next steps that can be shared between different countries.
And just to comment on this also, in France, when we finished an assessment, we used to say that we have only done half of the job. But the other half of the job is to set priorities. And the government asked us to help them to set the priorities. So we use the French category of the ACN red list, and then we have to add other criteria, like the global categories of the species, like the responsibility of France, and many other criteria. And after that, we end up to a list of priorities. And sometimes the list of priorities is very different from the list of endangered species. But it's true that it's another job, and it also takes a lot of time. It's something very important to do, to use carefully the red list and properly. It's also very interesting, and this is something that has to be thought at the beginning of the project. When you will have the red list, how are you going to use it to influence policies in a proper way?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Roger Mouffou from Cameroon. So I'm the president of a very young committee, IUCN committee, and the reason for me coming here was to learn. Because I think I'm a gap country. If I'm a gap country as far as national red list is concerned. And since last year, I tried to put it as a priority, trying to see how I can assure the training of the members of the committee to be acquainted to the importance of even the red list and take it into account in their activities. And because this is a very specific tool, which is very important for IUCN, very specific tool, very important contribution of IUCN. And the problem is that even, nationally or locally, there are some monitoring, ecological monitoring, but the result of implementing them is always very difficult. When we monitor everywhere within projects, but we don't see actually how we take it into account for decision making. So I will be trying to see how I can proceed by, of course, trying to train them so that they can understand the importance of red list, and then I'm going to try to make us to gather some specialists in the country to try to move forward, because I want the committee to be producing something like a regular product status of species and to move to a red list. So this is my comment.
I noticed that we have about 15 minutes left, so unless someone else wants to share their experience or ask any questions. Okay, we've got
Can I say something? No, it's okay. My name is Miguel. I work as program officer for the Brazil Plant Red List Authority, and I also work for the Brazilian National Center for Climate Conservation. So basically, I work doing red lists, but at the national level, I think it's very, very important that we can be capable to manage biodiversity data even more important than actually doing red lists. Because if we want to like actually make a difference for the species, like providing better chances of survival and doing on-the-ground action, we need to manage information. We need to be able to deal with that information. And sometimes we suffer a lot of pressure from the government. For example, Brazil, the Brazilian National Center for Plant Conservation was created to do red listing in 2008 because we didn't have nothing to show on the CBD meeting. So that's why they created the center. And when they asked us to do red listing, we said, come on, we don't have a species list. We don't have a plant species list. How can we do red listing? That's not possible. So let's give a step back and organize our data, organize our information, because if we want to save species, we need to, actually have the data accessible for different institutions, research institutions, policymakers, and everybody in the country. So it's very important that you create nationally mechanisms to access those data. For example, the French people, they have those NGOs and institutions that already